My name is Chris Paxson. I'm in the Woodrow Wilson School in the Department of Economics, and it's my pleasure to introduce Amy Glasmeier today. She has held appointments at Penn State and the University of Texas at Austin, and most recently she's been appointed head of MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, just as of January, right? Yeah. She's an expert in economic geography, regional planning, and spatial statistics. She has a BS in Environmental Studies and Planning from Sonoma State University and a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. She's published widely. I'm not going to list all of her book titles here, but her most recent book is very much in line with the topic of the talk today. It's An Atlas of Poverty in America, One Nation Pulling Apart, 1960 to 2003. And this book examines the experience of people and places in poverty since the 1960s, looks across the last 4 decades of poverty in America, and recounts the history of poverty policy since the 1940s. So I'm looking very much forward to this talk, and thanks for coming.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to need a microphone for this, but I think they're going to tape this, so I'll speak with it as an amplification. I'd like to begin by saying that this talk is a response that I had to having written the Atlas of Poverty, because you can't study poverty in the United States and not come across this famous saying, which Ronald Reagan said, which is, "We fought a war against poverty and poverty won." And I found, after spending a great deal of time with the statistics about poverty in the United States, that if you were to look at a series of maps over time, you would conclude the same thing. I personally didn't feel that there was a connection between what I could see on the maps and what I actually knew to have occurred in a policy context. So I thought that the way that I would understand it better was to use a different source of information besides statistics, and that was to return to the text of the time, which captured the public's reactions to and actions toward public policy starting in the 1950s. So what I'm going to talk about today is both the geography of poverty and the geography of poverty policy, because over the course of my career I have worked with various federal agencies that had the responsibility to execute national policy around poverty, poverty alleviation, and economic development. And as much as you saw a significant amount of resources spent to do this, yet we still have very similar patterns of poverty today. And so my comment, really, my punchline is that we stopped fighting poverty before we gave it a chance to actually be resolved. And that's no surprise to anybody that's a poverty scholar, and the Woodrow Wilson School has probably the nation's most significant collection of faculty who are interested in poverty. But if you really look at the way in which we undertook poverty policy, you'll note that its lifespan was very short. And the public interest in it and its commitment to it was also very short. And in thinking about how to prepare myself for the talk today, I have been thinking about President Obama, whose responsibilities are immense, not one of which is to fix the economy, but underlying that challenge is the fact that there is a population of Americans that still live with limited economic opportunities. And if anything, I would say they're pulling further apart from the nation as a whole, and they're becoming more geographically isolated. So that's what I'll talk about. It's not hard to become fascinated by the amount of material that's been written in the United States on poverty and poverty policy. And we've had many different attitudes toward the poor over the last 100 years. You can begin at the beginning of the 20th century, and you can see everything from the settlement movement forward through the 30s to the 50s to the 70s to the current period. One thing that's interesting is that every so often the themes converge, and the theme of the 20s ends up being the theme of the 50s, and the theme of the beginning of the century shows up at the sometime in the 70s. And so it does appear that there's a rediscovery of the relationship between poverty and poverty existence and the state of the nation. And this is just a report that was written in 2007, and the title is Economic Research Shows Adverse Impacts on Health Status and Other Conditions, which lead to a an impact on the economic growth rate. So this is just to give you a sense that in some ways, poverty is very intractable, and yet we come back around to the same sets of issues without really taking account of what we learned as we've moved through time. These were a set of comments that I picked off a while ago about what the presidential candidates thought about poverty in the United States. And you can see John McCain felt that the solution to poverty in the United States was a market solution, trying to bring economic development and market institutions to poor places. John Edwards invoked a moral response for the nation. Hillary Clinton connects poverty to the lack of jobs and the lack of wages paid to workers. And then Obama had a much more expansive policy, which was to actually target places and look at what the missing ingredients were and to spend enough time to actually try to make something happen. Now, each one of these characterizations can be found in the history of poverty policy. We could say McCain represents the era of sort of a Nixonian or maybe the early stages of Reagan. You could say Edwards probably stands almost a little bit to himself because there's not much that's being said. I would say that Hillary Clinton represents very much the perspective that her husband had. And Obama, if anything, you can find the language that he uses, and you can go back to the 1960s, and you can find very similar language that was used by John Kennedy and by Lyndon Johnson. So these are the themes that have framed poverty policy in the U.S. If you look over 50 years, given that the rhetoric is so similar, where can we place poverty policy today? Where can we actually see it in the context of the discussions that are taking place at the federal level? And what did we learn the last time there was a serious effort to try to reduce poverty through public policy? And then my last comment is really, are we really aiming at poverty at all? And is this a particularly difficult time to imagine elevating this long-standing public issue to the fore when we have an economy in as tough a shape as we do? Oh, sorry. So I'm going to talk first about the definition of poverty. For most of you that are here in the Wilson School, you probably know the definition of poverty by heart. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of poverty policy starting in the 1950s, just to give you my view of what happened from 1950 through the 1990s. From there, I'm going to go through a series of materials that I've collected, culled from national newspapers. I'm going to use the New York Times, but I could have localized this in other regions of the country and pulled up similar types of materials, and talk through what our conceptions of poverty were as we were moving from the 1950s forward, to give you a sense for how poverty as we understood it was quite a geographic phenomenon, and the policy response was in many ways not specifically a geographic policy, and as a consequence we end up unable to resolve the problem we aimed at, largely because we had multiple policy problems at the same time. And then I'll say something very brief about what I think students can do. To read the maps, you can see here, this is the legend for the maps that I will use. These are maps that are from my atlas, and basically the data are compiled into 5 equal-size intervals, and the intervals consist of counties, and the values of the maps of the intervals change depending upon the poverty statistic that I'm looking at. This is not a presentation with a scat of maps. It's only simply to show you an early and a late perspective. And then for those of you that are interested in looking at the frames of debates, I recommend that the New York Times Historic Archives is a great way to sort of delve into how we as a society have been viewing problems over time, because you can absolutely trace both economic cycles as well as public attitudes by looking at this material. So here's Molly Oshansky. Now, Molly was a dutiful public servant. She had a PhD, which made her somewhat unique at the time, but she couldn't get a job in academia, so she went into government. She worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well as the Social Security Administration, and she was personally interested in the well-being of family and children. and developed a metric that was really initially not for public consumption. It was really meant more as a marker in the agency that she worked with, and it so happened that at the time there was a need at the federal level for a mechanism for identifying who was poor, and so they used her measure. And her measure still stands today as the means by which we define people who are poor, and her original conception was 3 times the amount of money that families spent on food. So she calculated that a family on what's called a thrifty food budget would spend $1,000, and she multiplied it by 3, and that constituted the level under which people who had that income or less were considered poor. Molly Orshansky herself died in poverty, interestingly, and she died in the last decade. Okay, these are the HHS poverty guidelines for 2009. You can see that this is how much, $10,830 for an individual. If you use a 52-week year, 40-hour a week, $5.75 an hour wage, you would, comparing the minimum wage to the poverty rate, what you would see is that the minimum wage would get you about $11,960. So the minimum wage is just barely above the poverty rate, and for those of you that have ever done any calculations on how much it costs you to live, you would probably quickly determine that this would be very difficult for people to survive on. I have a living wage calculator on my website. The website's called povertyinamerica.psu.edu if you're interested, where we estimate using reoccurring data that for a family of 4, it's at least $36,000 to be able to pay for food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and very modest health care, as well as child care. So you can see that there's, that this is an absolute level of poverty as opposed to a relative. So it has no relationship to how we consume or access to the material world that we live in. This is an absolute level, which is quite distinct from our international partners such as the UK and countries on the continent. The UK uses 60% of the median income, which is significantly different. It's more along the lines of about $40,000. Okay. Oop. That's interesting. Well, the 2 slides that I have there may not come up, and they were not sure exactly why.
Very dark.
Yeah, well, the problem is that I composed it originally in a PC and then put it on a Mac, and I'm not sure. Anyway, the diagram, which you cannot see, unfortunately, is a depiction of the poverty rate in the United States from 1959 to 2007. And what you would notice is that in the 1959, poverty was about 40 million people, and it takes a significant dive in the 1970s, and it rises in the 1980s, and it has been stuck between about 11.7 and 15% for the last 20 years. The poverty rate in the 1950s was about 22% versus what it is today, which is, I think, 12.7. Well, it's actually now 13.3%, depending upon how it's being estimated. Okay, so, and let me just say that what is valuable about the graphics is the relationship between the business cycle and the graphics, because and the pattern of poverty over time. Because for a significant amount of time in the early era, from 1959 to about 1980, there was a relationship between the business cycle and poverty rate. As time has gone on, that relationship has varied and has not been as consistent. Okay, so the context of the American poverty policy. For those of you how many of you are from urban areas? How many of you from rural areas? Remote rural areas? Okay, so none of you have, how many of you have ever been to Appalachia? Mississippi Delta? U.S.-Mexico border? Okay, so you've been around in the parts of the United States that have economically challenged circumstances. So you have some visual sense of it. Okay, so if we go back to the 1950s, the nation faced a series of challenges. We had 3 economic recessions. we had the long-term effects of rural to urban migration. We had cities that were bulging at the seams in terms of absorbing people. We had automation of industry starting to take place. And the context, the understanding of poverty policy was that there was this dramatic demographic change that needed to take place, and we needed to somehow cope with it. In the 1960s, we faced first a period of economic recession, then a period of economic growth, and the public sentiment around people who were either unemployed or people who were poor was that they were undervalued assets that had to be utilized, and in order for them to be utilized, they had to be invested in. And so when you look at the discussion of the policy of the time, there's a significant emphasis on trying to improve the capability of individuals. Place matters. There's a recognition that different places have different experiences, there is a very strong political consensus in parts of the country, whereas there was a complete, I would say, disregard for economic circumstances in other parts. So the Northeast and the Midwest was a bit more conscious of the social obligations of the nation to the poor, whereas in the South, which was the nation's largest area of poverty, there was a much more complex relationship. In the 1970s, we go from a period of relative economic growth to a period of economic stagnation. We have the oil crises of the 1970s. Places that had historically had strong, high-wage jobs experienced significant losses in employment. The policy emphasis was no longer on thinking about people who were left behind as it was trying to shore up the problems that had emerged in the 1970s. To the extent that there was a recognition of place, there were places that had failed, that is, through their own actions had ended up losing their jobs, and there were places that were succeeding, and those were the Northeast and the Midwest were sort of thought of as, to some extent, failures because they had had high wages and stable jobs, whereas the migration from the North to the South was leading people to the belief that the South opened an opportunity that the North had lost. By the 1980s, we still are in a period of stagnation. We have the early 1982 economic crisis in which you see dramatic job losses in the manufacturing belt. And at the same time, you begin to see the rise of technology industries. There's class conflict, which is evident in cities and across regions. Individual places are under attack. And the poor begin to emerge as failures, social failures, that they have taken on certain characteristics and chosen not to follow the path of the American way. And we see the public retreat from any sense that there was social reasons for dealing with poverty problems. Essentially, we were blaming people who were poor for the circumstances that they found themselves in. And then finally, in the 1990s, we have an economic uptick. There's the development of the policy of welfare to work, which moved people into the workforce and altered the material standard of living, but not significantly. Spatial dispersion reduces the profile of place as a relevant category. So it's no longer that we are looking at one region doing well or poor and one region emerging as the next leading light. It's much more a mix. Now, back in the 1950s, there was a strong recognition that poverty in the United States had certain characteristics associated with it. Either there was a recognition that there was individual poverty, that is, an individual who, for whatever reason, had not been able to engage in the normal process of economic activity, and there was also a recognition that there were places that, for various reasons, were disengaged from the economy. Those often had to do with either displacement associated with agriculture, other natural resource-based industries, and in some cases, automation. There's a famous senator named Paul Douglas from Illinois who made a very important intervention in national policy by arguing from his perspective, which was his own personal region, that the industrial base of the past was locking people into natural resource-based areas, and that there needed to be policies that help them recover from unemployment, but also to help them either rekindle some sort of base where they were or to be able to move on. It was a very strong, long, and arduous fight. He introduced legislation over a decade trying to get some sort of federal policy that would deal with place-based poverty. But he was a very uncompromising individual, so it took a long time for him to finally make the deals necessary to form what became two policy instruments that one still lives today, the Area Redevelopment Agency and then the Economic Development Administration. Those two became the place-based economic development engines of our economic opportunities programs, which had a nominal association with poverty, but more importantly were seen as job programs. And this is the first map that the federal government made by EDA to take into account in 1960 those parts of the country where unemployment was a problem. And so you can see that the pervasiveness of the problem, you have to say, well, gee, this problem is huge. Well, one of the issues that EDA struggled with was trying to come up with some means of selecting places that would then be recipients of policy, and they picked a unemployment rate of 1% above the national rate, which of course put many places on the map. That particular decision would come back to harm the Economic Development Administration, because since everybody could get funded, ultimately nobody got enough money to make a difference. One of the things that probably many of you that have studied poverty policy in the United States knows is that there's a relationship between presidential elections and poverty in the United States. And so here's just a sampling of a commentary by Hubert Humphrey, who talks about the need to overcome the kind of poverty that we found in Appalachia. Interestingly, his recommendations were ones which I think have been very much contested over time. Everything from thinking about what level the minimum wage is, to allowing workers to organize, to dealing with migrant workers, and to dealing with workers who don't work full time. So these are the same sets of issues that we talk about today. We use different words, but essentially the same sets of issues were a part of the discussion in the late 1950s, early 60s. For poverty policy in the U.S., the 1960s presidential election was a watershed. Everybody knows the famous quote of John Kennedy, who goes into Appalachia in a bus and comes back and says, how can a nation with two such wealthy regions, the Northeast and the Midwest, have within it a region that has been lost in time? And that really begins the movement forward towards some sort of concerted effort for a national poverty policy. But the fact that Appalachia was the beginning of the national discourse around poverty, I believe, has a significant implication for what ultimately ends up being poverty policy, and also some of the attitudes toward whether or not we can actually resolve poverty in the United States, because the terms like white, poor, isolated, illiterate, unemployed, lost in time are as the language that people use to describe the people who were poor. So these are the images that were some that you can see. This is, unfortunately, this is too dark, but this is a classic house, and it's actually not in a holler, it's on a hill. A child that has some sort of disability, and then this map shows the percent of the population in Appalachia versus the percent of the absolute number of employment in the states, and this map is actually wrong. The color scheme is incorrect. The white numbers, the numbers in white are the total population, and the numbers in black are the percent of the population that's in Appalachia. But this was the kind of map that we had, and this becomes sort of indelibly burned into people's minds about what poverty constituted in the United States. Now, the original frame for rural poverty, because it quickly goes from poverty as an abstract idea to poverty as a rural problem, the original frame for it was things like fading jobs, the movement from agriculture and natural resources, that these were places that lacked infrastructure and basic services, and this comes back to form the basis of policy. Out-migration, that they were losing the brightest and the best. Appalachia lost 4 million people over the course of 40 years. That there was a lack of collective action, weakened political institutions. Many people spoke of them in far more negative terms, in terms of cronyism. And there's a famous saying that even exists today in Appalachia, which is, "Who's your daddy?" And that tells you what your connection is to the power structure where you are. There was also gaps in leadership from the state level, which had, interestingly, state governors in parts of Appalachia had their own negative views of people who lived in their region. So, you could talk to the governor of Alabama, and he would speak of Alabama, Appalachia in a way that would make you think that that part of the state wasn't a part of the entire state of Appalachia. There was also the role of racism and the legacy of slavery, which certainly is evident in the southern part of the region, but there are certain backdrafts in the central part of the region as well, because the coal mines brought in African Americans to bust the unions during the 1950s and 60s. Now, interestingly, there aren't very many maps in the New York Times about poverty in the United States, so this is one of the few for the 1960s, and I think we have too many lights to be able to really, I don't know if I could find a light to...
I think it's up here. Here. Heading.
Okay.
Is that better?
Great, that's better. Okay, so this is the map that was evident in the New York Times when Lyndon Johnson was attempting to get Congress to unite and form a poverty policy. And so what you see here is the percent of the families living in poverty, and the Northeast is 14, the South is 32, the West is 15, and the North Central is 16%. And these are bar graphs that tell you age, education, and color. And so the most important thing is that it was between 25 and 64 years of age, head of households that were the largest group of people who were poor, and then secondarily the elderly, and then people of color, and then obviously there was a correlation between levels of education and poverty rates in terms of the head of the household. I think that's all to say there. Let me go back and just say that one of the things that we now know today, and certainly I learned when I was doing my atlas, was that using these giant units, these regional units, hide the truly distinct pattern of poverty in the United States. And it was the case that this, while the first opening of the public perspective on poverty quickly gave way to a recognition that there were these much more particular attributes of poverty in the United States. So here we have poverty in the Southwest, which is an enduring problem, where Native Americans who had historically been moved from their lands and placed in often economically non-viable locations end up in places with poor housing, lack of infrastructure, lack of education, etc., and most particularly social isolation. Another region of the country, once very rich, was the iron region of the Great Lakes, and this too experienced high poverty rates as the natural resource base began to decline and out-migration took place. And then across the South, we have rural slums that were both impacting both white and black people. It was somewhat indiscriminate as to who was affected by it. And so the regional picture was one of great diversity. And it was also one that presented two starkly different images, because the image of the Iron Range was one that was underpinned by formerly relatively high-paying jobs for male workers, which all of a sudden then experienced a significant decline in employment. So the bottom line was the problem was really an access to jobs issue. Whereas in the Native American lands and in parts of the South, the problem was far more the collapse of the economic base that wasn't that good to begin with. So you have sharecropping, and you have other jobs that paid low wages. But there were two different perspectives. One was the problem is we need to have jobs for people that have been unemployed, and the other was that we have this intractable problem of deep-seated poverty. Now, as you can imagine, the issue of jobs is a much more pervasive issue, and it's a much more short-term episodic phenomenon compared to long-term poverty. And what we see over the course of the next 20 years is the ascent of the importance of employment and the decline in the recognition of the importance of poverty as an issue to be dealt with in and of itself. It was also true that during this period of poverty policy formation, while the rural areas were drawing significant attention, it was the cities that were experiencing the greatest pressures from the migration of the past and the collapse of economic opportunities. So it wasn't just the case that poverty became a rural problem. It was definitely recognized quickly as an urban problem, but the policies didn't get formulated rapidly enough to respond to the needs and the concerns of mayors, which become a problem for policymakers afterward when the mayors themselves begin to reject the kinds of policy programs that were formulated at the federal level. So here's the text of Lyndon Johnson's call to arms for the need to fight a war on poverty. And what's important is to remember that by the time he begins to point out the need for poverty, the statistics had gone from as much as half of the nation in the 1940s, 30s and 40s being in poverty, to something on the order of 20%. And so the numbers had significantly diminished. And of those numbers, a significant number of them were those who had lost their jobs on a temporary basis. But you can find some interesting comments about just the nature of what people's lives were by reading the text in which he talks about the fact that poverty is passed on through generations, that poverty constitutes isolation, that these are people that have never had an opportunity to make a choice about the lives that they lead. And so he begins the war on poverty. And so recognizing that you have these multiple images of what is poor, who is poor, and the causes are changing dynamically, even as the president is formulating his policy, you're beginning to see working its way into the rhetoric the role that employment plays simply as a necessary ingredient to get the Congress to vote for poverty policy overall, which eventually comes back to be a problem when the public accepts jobs programs, but it rejects poverty policies. Okay. So what were the problems that the cities faced? The cities faced population groups that were unable to find work. They could find jobs, but they didn't pay living wages. Housing was unavailable. There's a whole history of the development of defense housing in the 1940s that was designed to act as a basis for clearing the slums and trying to in a sense, re-establish an urban fabric. Healthcare was unavailable. Many people did not, there was still a very significant population of immigrants where you had a diversity of languages, so schools were ill prepared to manage both differences in socioeconomic status as well as differences in languages. And the big city mayors, who were at the time incredibly powerful, they were significantly more powerful than they are today, I would say, began to push against White House policy, calling the policies coming out of the White House as very selective and unresponsive to urban needs. So the policy is formulated, and it's only 5 months after the policy is actually begun to be implemented that criticism takes hold. And what's interesting is there's criticism both within people that are working on behalf of the poverty policy, as well as people who have who were really not 100% in support of it, but went along with it simply because that was the mood of the nation and of the president. What's interesting is just to think about what they were talking about in terms of policy. So there were job training programs, there were youth corps, there were home renovation programs, there were early childhood programs. So all of the programs that we have at least some inkling of today were formulated there. But what was interesting is how small an effort they were, really, compared to the problems at hand. And also the fact that there was a criticism within Congress that all of these elements of the program had been tried in the past and had not succeeded. Now, it is the case that there weren't very many evaluations of policies like this at the time, but there was a lot of contention about whether or not it was possible to solve the problem. And most importantly, in this second map is the recognition that poverty itself was really complicated, and that we didn't understand it, that it did vary across space, and that we would be far better to put our emphasis on trying to generate jobs and reduce unemployment and try to allow, rising tides lift all boats than to struggle with all the socio-cultural issues associated with poverty. This is an image of Bobby Kennedy going into Appalachia. Again, everybody goes back to Appalachia as a place to call forth the public's attention to poverty, when very few people in America had attachment to this place. It wasn't a place that they knew very well. It was never a very significant, it's a significant piece of geography, but isn't necessarily a significant population base. But what Kennedy is doing is preparing himself for running for president, but he's also arguing that the policies aren't big enough, they're not focused enough, and they're definitely not calibrated to deal with the kinds of problems that places like Appalachia had. By the late 1960s, the federal government and the public had lost their stomach for poverty policy. And we began to see the movement away from an agreement that we could solve poverty as an issue. And there was a growing discord in the cost of the policies relative to what was going on in the economy. The war was raging. It was spending, at that time, $30 billion a year. I didn't do the calculations to figure out what it was worth, but I can assure you that was a very significant sum of money. So there was a sense that the Great Society was too costly, that it had not made enough of a dent in the problems that we were trying to deal with, and there was a beginning sense of retreat. At the same time, we have the pent-up frustration of people living in urban areas who were simultaneously constrained by access to very low standard living circumstances. So if you read books on the city of Detroit as an example, the location where immigrants and people of color lived were these desperate circumstances, and it was just a powder keg. And you at the same time have the movement in of the former immigrant neighborhoods by people that were different and people that had different ways of life. And you have essentially this urban struggle that emerges, which again, when you think about from the standpoint of policy, the sense is that what if we put all this money into this and yet we haven't had any positive response? Not just that, we're starting to have riots. And the recognition that African Americans who were presumed to be some of the targets for these policies, in fact, had really not changed their circumstances at all. And we begin to see by the 1970s a reframing of the poverty debate, completely away from the sense that this is something we as a nation can't withstand or choose to overcome, to a belief that the people who are poor are not living up to the American ideals, and we need to move toward a new set of policies. And the underlying causes of poverty begin to be no longer viewed as the unfortunate circumstances of either an individual's life chances or the place that they end up. And we begin to see policies being criticized for their failure. I think by 1974 it was clear the nation had lost its courage. There was much less of a belief that poverty policy could work, a much stronger need for economic development policies to try to deal with workforce dislocation. We have the same time we have women entering the labor force. And so the policy reframing takes place of a shift away from the concern for the poor toward a focus on reviving the economy and getting the regional base of industrial activity in the Midwest and the Northeast back together again. Now these are the first set of maps that I have. And simply to show you, this is the picture of poverty in the United States in the 1970s. We didn't actually have data that would allow us to make as calibrated a map as this is in the 1960s. There's one data series. I have one map of the 1960s data. But what this basically tells you in a nutshell is that in 1970, so this is after the first round of investments of the Great Society programs, we have this pattern, which is deep poverty in Appalachia, in the South, in the Mississippi Delta, along the U.S.-Mexico border, in Indian lands, a little bit up in the seacoast, and along the Front Range here. And this doesn't matter whether you're looking at children that are poor, whether you're looking at elderly who are poor, families who are poor. That same pattern is repeated in most of the poverty statistics. And there is a relationship between levels of education and poverty. You can see that there's, this is the percent of the population over 12 years old with under 12 years of education, so less than a high school education. And you can see that there's a significant concentration in the South. And then here's a map with great contrast, which is where unemployment is, and unemployment is not evident to a significant degree in the agricultural region, some in the Delta, but really not as much as you would think given this map on education. And the reason is because of the way in which we calculate unemployment statistics, right? Because if you're unemployed, you have to be looking for work or ready and able to work in order to be considered that you are unemployed. Well, for many of the people that lived in the poor parts of the region, they weren't even registered for employment. And so the focus of the policy on unemployment sort of misses the greater issues for them, which are really things like education, infrastructure, et cetera. By the late 1970s, there's a very strong sentiment that policies to rectify poverty have been unsuccessful. There's a significant retreat from the public belief that there's something that we can do, and we begin to see the fraying of policy in one form and another, and people recognizing that this is going to have a significant impact on the poor. Now, it is interesting that even as people were criticizing the Great Society programs, there were people that actually taught at this school who spoke of the value of the policies for the impact that they did have. So it wasn't that they had no impact at all. It was more that they were not, I would argue, they were not significantly carefully calibrated to adjust for the differences in places, nor were they persistent enough to really have a sustained impact in many of the places. If you calculate the amount of money that EDA spent on individual counties, it was in the tens of dollars per person. Or if you looked at what the Appalachian Regional Commission spent in Appalachia, we're talking about in the hundreds of dollars a person when you have problems that are significantly in excess of anything like that. And then once again, Appalachia is brought back up as an issue. As a matter of fact, Appalachia has been used time and again for policy purposes when it has been important to bring out a region to use as an example for national policy. And this map was actually used as part of a discussion of having employment policy rather than having poverty policy. This is just a comment of saying that the war on poverty, some of the policies did in fact make a difference. So 10 years later after that, in the early 1990s, what kind of a policy frame do we have? Well, the discussion has completely changed. And now places that are poor are being spoke of in terms of needing to become more competitive, to align themselves with the national economy. And there's Bill Clinton's famous bus tour through Appalachia, in which he talked about bringing jobs, bringing small business loan programs to places which had been left behind. But the same sets of images and actually the same sets of circumstances in the hollers of Appalachia still hold today. But this is what I would call is reframing the debate about how we should address national issues of enduring poverty. Okay, so these are maps of 2000, and these are simply to say that if you look at the same characterization, the numbers are definitely smaller. So in the 1970s, we had poverty rates that were 60 and 70%. And in 2000, we have poverty rates that are significantly less than that, 56% max, 41%, 46, 56. But the patterns are still quite evident. And so Appalachia still remains a region of poverty. We have poverty up in the upper Great Plains, which is partly associated with natural resources, partly associated with Native Americans. Interestingly, the border region has remained one of the poorest regions in the country since we began collecting statistics. But you do see the indelible impact of the industrial heartland's growth over the 20th century, inasmuch as you don't find poverty, even though there has been significant decline in the economic base, that there was something associated with good-paying jobs and economic fortune. Well, that's not going to come through. This was a map that I had that's a recent map by people at Brookings Institute who have looked at, so poverty has gone from, its level of intensity has gone down, but its geographic signal is still significant. And what the work by Brookings has showed using earned income tax credit data is that poverty has become highly geographically isolated. So you have pockets of very intense poverty that is essentially miles apart from any contact with any sort of smooth gradient of income. So you have these very intense pockets, and they're isolated in American cities, but we also have the same pattern in rural areas as well. Let's see if that map, no, that map won't come up either. Well, so I said I was going to speak for 40 minutes, and I'm a little bit over. So the nation is clearly a different place than the 1960s, and the nature of poverty and its intensity has changed. Having said that, the biggest change really took place in the reduction in poverty of the elderly, whose incomes were indexed in the early 1970s, which have kept them on par with inflation, which is different from what we see in other types of federal programs. Poverty is certainly less, but it still exists, but it is probably more geographically hidden. So you can drive long distances before you come across any type of economic deprivation in the country. But we have new groups, we have new locations, we have persistent causes. One of the challenges for existing federal agencies like Economic Development Administration or the Appalachian Regional Commission is that those same sets of conditions that defined the region in the early 1960s can still be found if you follow up a trail into the hollers or you go to a place like Harlan County, that even though it has infrastructure and even though it has public education, there are still many people left behind. I would say, and these are just sort of my concluding comments, that the current period is not a very propitious time for people interested in the truly poor in the United States. The economic circumstances are very bleak, that if you look at the history of poverty policy over the last 50 years, you see that there's a reduction in interest in the poor as the economic business cycle goes negative and people of middle class or below middle class incomes feel economically vulnerable. So just as we're at a time where you would think on a political basis we would have strong belief on the part of folks in the Obama administration to try to reduce poverty, it's going to be very difficult for them to do it because the sorts of policies that they're talking about really don't align with the persistence of poverty or even new poverty that is not attached to the loss of jobs. And what would I say in terms of what they should do? There still remain the same sets of problems. You can go into poor communities and education is in abysmal arrears. You can find that the infrastructure is poor. You can find that the jobs are either non-existent or they require no skills. So the many of the kernels of what we understood starting in the 1960s still apply today. How do we do that, though? Well, I would argue that what's really different from the 1960s and today is that we can actually look at problems at a much more refined level than ever before and treat them in a surgical way rather than making blanket policy. So, for example, the biggest criticism of the Economic Development Administration is that all of its programming could essentially go to 2,400 counties out of 3,140 counties. So basically, almost every place in the country could get money from that program. As a result, it would not have an impact on places that really needed assistance. So today, we can actually use all the tools that students have access to, we have access to as policy analysts, to use to craft policies that are a lot more localized and a lot more sensitive to the circumstances that are there. And I think geography in that way is the clue to that sort of activity. And I also think that something that we can do that is just beginning to become popular is to integrate quantitative and qualitative research. I can think of some work that's been done by Linda Burton and a fellow named Steve Matthews that integrates GIS with ethnography to follow the daily pathways of mothers who are single parents who at the same time have to get their children to school or to the doctor and be at a job on time, to try to make it obvious how complex our lives are when we have limited income. I think another issue that's important to consider is just exactly what the 2010 census is going to mean for public policy. You all probably know that the long form is gone, so our ability to connect the same time series together with the census of 2000 is no longer available, and we're going to have to play around with the data to be able to use it. That's going to present a very important empirical challenge. Let me tell you that policymakers are going to use it to their own best interest. I gave a talk in Long Beach, and the mayor was using the American Community Survey, and the previous year Long Beach had the highest urban unemployment or urban poverty in the United States, and the next year the number had gone down. It was 29%, it went down to 22%, and the mayor introduced me and he said, we've made these great strides, we've dropped from 29 to 22, and I looked at him and I thought, do you have any idea whether you can use the data to actually say that? So we're going to see a lot of misuse of information that I think is something we as consumers of it need to work very hard to get rapid analysis out to make a difference. I would say that the last comment is, one of the other things that we can do with the tools that we have is we can make flexible boundaries, and we can actually define problems without the burden of counties, and in so doing you could look at problems a very different way. If you were to examine poverty in the United States using different geographies, you get very, very different results. You either feel that it's as bleak as possible or completely hopeful. So using the tools that we have to try to make more transparent the problems that we're interested in, I think is an opportunity that stands before all of us. So thank you.
We have some time for
I did it itself.
Great. We have time for questions. Do you want to take your own questions?
Sure. Okay. Mr. Glickman.
I think there's a great overview of the issues from poverty in the last 40 years. Having said that, there's a couple of questions about what you've done. I think in terms of poverty, and all due respect to Mrs. Orshansky, the late Mrs. Orshansky, we don't measure poverty very well or very accurately. The 3 times agricultural spending or food spending doesn't really cut it. I think a more important way of looking at poverty is not so much poverty, but it's inequality. And there we've seen dramatic declines in equality in this country. Over the last 40 years, last 30 years, virtually all of the growth, and there's been substantial economic growth at times, has gone to the top 5% of the income distribution. And the lower 80% really are at best even. And the lower end, they've lost ground since the 1970s. And part of this, I think, has to do with this war on poverty that we really didn't fight. We didn't fight it for very long. I give some credit to Lyndon Johnson for what he did in that period, but it didn't last for very long. Part of the pushback of the Great Society was the mayors, because the mayors were being bypassed by Lyndon Johnson. Money was going directly to community organizations, and they didn't like that. Ask anybody in Chicago where Obama grew up about that, right? So money was going past the mayors to community organizations, and that was not going to cut it with the mayors. The mayors didn't like that. But after Johnson, and to some degree after Nixon, the war on poverty, the tension of poverty disappeared. And particularly after Reagan, the glorification of the market and the glorification of an inactive government really took over. And so I think it was more a function of not having an active government, which I think Obama wants to bring back. Certainly he's talking about that. That's what took place, I think, since 1980, roughly.
You know,
the end of any battle to try to reduce inequality during that period.
Unlike Britain, in the United States, we can't look at geographically in great detail easily at questions of inequality. You can use housing data, and there is some data that you can use looking at income, but it's really difficult to work with, and there are very few people that have. So from the perspective of being able to look at inequality, to really be able to unearth it, to unmask it, it's very difficult. And so and I would also say that when you're in discussions with policymakers and they're sitting there staring at you, they want to use the tried and true statistics, and when you bring something in that they personally, ideologically find problematic, it's hard to contend with. To the question about the mayors pushing back, one of the problems that Obama has right now is trying to figure out what the right pathway is so that people aren't bypassed. There are some programs that they've created that the governors don't have anything to say about. They're mad about that. You have some programs that move from the cities quickly down to a much more localized level, and the mayors are mad about that. You have counties that are parts of multi-regional organizations, and they can't get access to the resources, and they're mad about that. So, and what's interesting is if you know anybody in the administration, it's like a minefield, right? They come up, they get up every day, and it's a minefield, and it's like, which thing am I going to step on today that's going to get me into trouble? Because they're having to think so quickly, they can't anticipate where people are going to be angry and then get pushback. So let's wish them the best of luck.
You mentioned earlier the maps regarding education and its link to poverty. What I was trying to figure out was, are there better methods by which to provide quality education? Because given that poverty is localized in particular areas, you can often find that, again, education is not readily at the quality that it should be in these areas, mostly because it's funded on a mechanism based on property taxes in that particular localized area. Are there any thoughts that you come across on how to refinance our education system to help bridge the gap in areas now? Money's not always the answer, but I mean that seems like a huge problem in overall trying to overcome poverty in localized areas, especially if it's linked to education. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that at all.
I haven't. I will say that for those of you that like to make maps and analyze data, that you can get much more disaggregated data than we have typically seen looking at school districts, because the National Institute for Educational Statistics will give you school district and ultimately individual school locations. So you can you can do certain kinds of assessments to try to figure out, is a school in a poor tract or a rich tract. There's lots of tiling tools to actually look at what the inequality actually is, which I think is part of the story just to begin with. In terms of do we know what to do, given that those inequalities exist, the only thing that I know of is to sue for inequality, right? I mean, that's the access to equal education is something that people have been successful in the courts struggling over. But I would say that one of the challenges today is not just the direct relationship between income and education, because we look at the type of job that's being generated, where the jobs are being generated, the level of education that matters to get a job. I mean, I'm beginning to see, and I think the statistics, anybody looking at the statistics would see the same thing, is that it used to be there was a divergence between high school education and income over the lifetime and a college education. So the more college education, you had a college education, you would experience a rise in your income. Well, we're beginning to see that that's flattening out, and that difference is diminishing over time. What does that mean? I don't think we actually have a very good idea of what the labor market of the future is going to look like, what we need to prepare people for, which I think gets at a much more troubling issue when it comes to public policy, is that just a high school education, or maybe just even a bachelor's degree, isn't necessarily going to offer you economic stability over time.
There's some scholars at Brookings that have looked at the distribution of poverty too, and one of their findings is that poverty is moving from urban areas into suburban areas. I was wondering if that was something that you had found as well.
Yes, if you disaggregate, I have maps that are disaggregated, and you most certainly do see that. You also have a problem between 1990 and 2000 in that there were policies that dispersed the largest concentrations of the poor. Hope 6 was an example. And by just moving a few people over one border or another, it looks as if the intensity of poverty has declined. But if you look at a unit like Detroit and you say, okay, I'm looking at the center county, you'll notice the numbers haven't declined. It's just that the intensity has declined. So when you're looking at these changes, you have to recognize that there are very fine-grained sources of those changes that you need to understand. In some cases, it's suburban poverty, but that's not telling you why. What's telling you why is that there were policies to actually disperse the poor. But you definitely see that. I mean, what'll be interesting, again, is what do we do with the 2010 census? How do we address that? I mean, that'd be a great class project, right? Bring everybody and all their capabilities to really be the first ones out of the gate to analyze the 10 years of American Community Survey data. You'd be in the news all the time.
You talked about how different politicians, specifically presidents, kept going back to Appalachia as like this region to look at to, I guess, bring the nation back to focusing on poverty. And I recently read an article in Newsweek that talked about how the governor of West Virginia wanted to reverse the stereotypes about Appalachia from being like this hillbilly poor region. Do you see that as having any effects on how politicians are framing the locations of poverty or anything like that?
Well, one thing that's important to realize is that Appalachia is not far from Washington, D.C. So policymakers could get there, as opposed to going to the Delta. I would also, or going to southeast Washington, D.C., where they would certainly see plenty of poor people. So that, I guess that was too far away. There has been significant change in Appalachia as a whole. The whole outer edge of the region has become much more like their neighbors. So what has happened is poverty has declined the closer you were to more urbanized areas and the closer you were to places that had economic opportunity. So overall, the conditions have most certainly improved. Vi, he's a good friend. But having said that, the core of Appalachia, is the absolute core of Appalachia is very similar. And Appalachia is also beginning to fragment in terms of the kinds of problems that are there. So the north has been slowly declining, and there is a pure absence of jobs, and simultaneously there's a remigration of the children of the parents who moved to the urban areas of the north, Cincinnati, Cleveland, etc. They're actually migrating back into northern Appalachia. They have lower levels of education. They have less successful employment histories, and they're migrating back to where their grandparents are and to their family home areas. So that's one process going on. And then in the southern part of Appalachia, you have the industrialization post-1950 that's begun to collapse. So all of the textile plants and a lot of the low-wage manufacturing employment. So in fact, Appalachia is sort of starting to wobble a bit. Many people in West Virginia would like to be considered something other than an Okie. And by the way, it was people inside of Appalachia that created that identity, not people from the outside. I would say that there is a lack of recognition of the multiplicity of places where there is deep poverty in the U.S. And Appalachia gets a bad rap. I think part of it because of historical legacy, part of it is geographic proximity. But it is the case that the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is the only regional commission of the 8 original commissions that still exists to this day, still gets $60 million in federal appropriation, still programs money for water and sewer, roads, etc., and has the best statistical history of a region in the country. So if anybody's looking for a thesis topic and they want to get a nice, very rich overview, it's the only part of the country that has been completely and utterly thoroughly studied. There are maybe 40 reports on the Commission's website, all about everything you can imagine.
If I understood you correctly, your policy advice centers around a strategy of better calibration of anti-poverty spending, and it would be calibrated according to a particular spatial unit. I was wondering what spatial unit you would prefer in that case. And it doesn't seem like it's obvious to me. You showed regions and counties. It seems to me that neighborhoods would be theoretically an important one, but of course there are no neighborhood governments that can receive federal money to then allocate it. So I was wondering what you thought about those issues and why you think that the spatial aspect of anti-poverty policy is so important, rather in terms of policy implementation, rather than just focusing on people that are poor and targeting individuals.
That's a great question. The first question is there is no, I think, absolutely perfect unit of analysis. For different purposes, I think you would use different types of geography. I think that why you would want to deal with something on a particular basis is because right now, when we use the county, unless the agency is extremely sensitive to localized conditions, they can pour a ton of money in a county that has a very specific pocket of poverty, and the money is spent on the other side of the county. So if we don't call attention to where the problem is, and we presume that people otherwise will migrate to where the investment was, then we're spending money, I think, very unwisely. And it tends to diminish the public's belief that the state can do anything at all. So I think you have to focus, at least to some extent, on the problem. Now, in terms of how do you actually administer the resources, should you have them? It's a great question because you're right. There aren't necessarily entities that can zoom in at a neighborhood and make an impact. But if you were simply to say to the counties that have the authority to distribute resources, you must pick intra-county locations which match the socioeconomic conditions that these funds are aimed for, they can absolutely do it because they know where those things are, right? So it's not that there isn't a political vehicle that can do it. It's really more that unless at the federal level the agency is setting up requirements that call for targeted investments, you just don't get it. EDA tried, but I did an analysis of 250 projects all over the country, and they said they absolutely pinpointed the projects that they invested, but every time we went into a place and tried to ground truth the data, we found the investment was way away from where the actual problem was. So it's almost like you have to have the diligence to do it.
I think we should take one more question. Yeah.
My question is actually very closely related. I was reading something a couple weeks ago that was talking about place-based poverty programs versus person-based poverty programs, and the author's argument was that why are we investing in places where nobody wants to live? If the majority of people in these pockets of poverty really want to get out, what we need to do is invest in people so that they can get jobs elsewhere. And so I was wondering what you thought about that. I mean, it's only halfway compelling to me. I mean, I think we can't just desert the idea of investing
there's a man named Mark Partridge who is at Ohio State University, and he wrote a book called The Geography of Poverty. And what he showed statistically was that if you invest in poor places, if jobs occur in poor places, people will take those jobs and their incomes will rise. So one argument is that poor people just live in these places and they won't, even in the presence of jobs, they won't get the jobs, right? So why would you want to do that? If you can't deliver what you're trying to deliver, why bother to do anything in a particular place at all? Do instead what you said, which is to invest in people. In the United States, we believe that people can live where they want to live. And so if we had no evidence that investing in place, providing jobs in place, would lead to a material change in a poor person's life, then I could see maybe that you could imagine policies that would might move people out of there. But if you can show that investments in location actually materially change the lives of people who have low incomes, then it does seem to have some basis to say you can make investments in a place. I don't think it's an either or. I think it is a question of and. I will say that the places of persistent poverty, the places that I can show you 40 years of very long-term poverty, have certain other socioeconomic characteristics that are very, very problematic. So, for example, along the border, in the Mississippi Delta, in Appalachia, in the Indian lands, you have extremely low labor force participation rates of men, not of women, of men. So when you have had that, and why do I think that's important? Because men send messages to male children in ways about value and work and ethics and all sorts of things that if men are completely removed from the workforce entirely, then you're beginning to set up a situation where just the notion of what's the proper thing to do, what do you do for your daily activities, I think that becomes quite fragile. And in those locations, I think that we really have no idea what we do with truly persistently poor locations. And what I really worry about are the children. I did a study on the health economics and the environment for children in Appalachia, and we were able to show that there's a life cycle. So in the early 0 to 5 period of a child's life, they're 10% off national norms, but basically they're very similar. Between 6 and 11, they are within they begin to start falling off compared to the national norms. But they still, when you talk to them, have aspirations like I could be a scientist, I could be an astronaut, etc. By the time they hit their teens and they realize that stuff they see on TV is not going to be their lives, and they see their parents and they're not employed, their whole sense of what their opportunities are really diminish significantly. And at least when we interviewed the kids, it was really just profound for my students to see that there was a sense of hopelessness by the time you got to be 17. So how we deal with that question in these places of deep persistence, and there's about 300 counties in the United States that have very high persistent poverty. What do we do about that? I think that's a really big challenge. That do I think that, and I think some of the metropolitan areas that Obama is most likely to target because he's an urban president as opposed to a suburban or rural president, I think he's going to face those same kind of problems, that these are deep, deep challenges that take some very, very fundamental transformation at the local level. There's a guy named Lucky Yapa, who I used to work with at Penn State, who has a very different point of view about poverty, totally different than almost anybody. And his argument is essentially, rather than thinking that you're going to make something unrealistic for a place that is persistently poor, you look at the very basic needs that people have: clean water, food, decent shelter, and you use those as economic development tools, and you actually engage people in those sets of property activities as a way of giving them a sense of purpose and meaning and having a positive environment to be around, because it's out of that will come people's aspirations. So that's an alternative point of view.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great
Thank you.
perspective on poverty.